Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last Tuesday Times Roundtable of this semester. We're excited to have you here, even though it's finals week, and so we thank you for taking some time from studying and joining us in this conversation. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. George Gonos. He holds a PhD in sociology from Rutgers University and has taught employment and labor relations since 1998. Before coming to FIU in 2015, Dr. Gonos taught for 18 years at the State University of New York in Potsdam. His research explores non-standard employment arrangements, and he's a leading expert on temp agency work in the US. His articles have appeared in Law and Society Review, Employment Rights and Employment Policy Journal, Politics and Theory. Dr. Gonos is active in advocacy work with worker centers and community-based organizations. He's a founding board member of Temp Worker Justice and appears in the documentary A Day's Work on the horrific rate of injury and death for temp workers on the job. He enjoys music, sports, and outdoors. Let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jenny.
One more thing, you can get food, you can ask questions, you can interact, and those of you who are Global Learning Medallion students, you can see me at the end to get your points. Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome to interrupt me at any point with questions or comments or hysterical outbursts, whatever comes up. I'm hoping that at least the young people here go away from this presentation with some tips about how to navigate our labor market and the landmines that have been placed all around for us. The people who are already in the job market here, it's too late. Just kidding. So when it comes to building your earning power, education is really important, right? Yes. There's really no question about it. Another New York Times article you can refer to, just to tell you about one study which tells us about the importance of getting your degree. But then, you go back a ways, there's my dad. He's gone quite some time now. But he didn't have a high school education. And yet, he made a living wage, $25 or $30 an hour in today's money terms. He made time and a half pay for overtime, double time for Sundays, health insurance for the family. How do you explain that when someone hadn't graduated high school? Well, maybe he's a good con man, but that wasn't it. He was a factory worker in a feeder plant for General Motors, which made automobiles, still does. The lesson is education is extremely important, but so is government policy in terms of creating a context where we, all of us, regardless of our level of education, can earn a living wage and live a decent life. Over the past 40 years, the world of work has undergone a major makeover, and the news hasn't been good. Work has been reshaped in the interests primarily of big employers. That means they've actively changed or reinterpreted our laws and our regulations. And their primary purpose in doing so really was to fatten their own wallets, not to help workers. And so it's become a gloves-off economy. Pretty much anything goes. A lot of it is very predatory. I don't like that. And the changes are continuing full speed under the current administration. We'll talk about some of those current things going on. Just some background. I won't spend time on this. The hourly wage earned by the average American worker has been stagnant or even declining for 40 years, since 1979. Worker productivity has grown enormously, but the surplus wealth that extra productivity has created has gone, nearly all of it has gone to bosses, not workers. There's some great graphs at the Economic Policy Institute if you want to take time to check those out. So what's the cause of these stagnated wages for American workers? Is it, invisible forces that we're always told about, like technology, globalization? Is it just this thing they call the economy that seems like the weather beyond anyone's control? No, employers have rapidly been turning good jobs into bad jobs with the help of government. When I talk about politics, I'm not referring to some vague or abstract arena. I mean, there are companies and industries that contribute large amounts of money to our representatives. Those industries write their own laws, and they send lobbyists in to talk to those legislators about why those laws are good for America. They make a good case. And because sometimes there's campaign contributions attached to those, many of these laws go through. Some regulations can be changed through our executive agencies or executive branch without going through the legislature. We'll look at those too. So what I want to talk about are what are the devious schemes and devices and scams that employers have set up, especially for young people. And I'm going to offer you a little primer. As we go, I'm really interested in hearing about your work experiences, your experiences on the job, whatever kind of work you may have had. Since the 1970s, we've seen the rapid growth of what they call alternative work arrangements. And this is an extended list. It's a longer list than the Bureau of Labor Statistics ever gives you. You'll see I put a couple in here to relate to the academic community. Internships, adjuncts. These are ways that we, in the academic community get stuck in low-wage, dead-end positions.
Sorry, I'm just curious because I hear a lot in the UK about zero-hour contracts, and it seems like those are kind of analogous to the gig economy you're describing, but I haven't seen the term mentioned either here or on there, but I hear it a lot in the UK. But
Right.
it includes the term contract, and a lot of what you're talking about is like non-contractual work, but zero-hour contract implies kind of a contract in which people are disposable in the same way. So do you know anything about that?
Not much. It's a term that we don't use in the U.S. And I'm not going to try to define it. I think if you want, I'll communicate with you about it, and we can find out more about what they really mean by those zero-hour contracts. But you're correct in saying that it mirrors, in many ways, what we talk about here as temp agency work. So,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
oh, sorry.
Over here.
Hi.
On that list,
I'm sorry, I didn't
that's
see
okay.
you.
On that list, it said something about involuntary part-time work. I've never heard of that before. What is that?
Well, there are many millions of part-time workers, and part-time work is defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics as working less than 40 hours in a week. Many people who have part-time jobs really would prefer to work full-time, but they haven't been able to find that full-time job, and so they take one or two or maybe three part-time jobs to try to piece together a living. It doesn't work very well. So involuntary part-time work means you want a full-time job, but you've only got a part-time job, because so many employers are converting work into part-time work. This helps them in so many ways. They pay lower wages to part-time workers even when they're doing exactly the same work as a full-time worker. They don't provide benefits often to part-time workers. And, well, they're easily disposable. Many times, even where there's a union, part-time workers aren't covered. That's in fact true in the university. I'm talking about for adjunct instructors, for instance, who aren't part of the union that represents the faculty. So that's a really good question. There's an excellent report on the growth of involuntary part-time work, again on the EPI website, Economic Policy Institute website. I was trying to bring that man here who did that study, and I haven't been able to do that yet. So going back to like my dad in the old days, what they call a traditional job was based on a direct employee-employer relationship. You were legally employed by the company that you performed work for. And that's what's been changed or undermined in recent times. I call it dissociative types of work. A number of the schemes, a number of the work arrangements we're going to look at, what they do is they cut apart or they sever the employer-employee relationship, turn workers into non-employees of the parent company they work for. I call them dissociative work arrangements because employers deliberately dissociate themselves from workers, turning workers literally into nobodies in the workplace. Don't know your name? They don't want to know your name. Devious scheme number one. I call it bogus self-employment. You know what self-employment means? It's being in business for yourself. Technically, it's called being an independent contractor, right? But bogus self-employment means the worker is not really in business for themselves. The parent employer is controlling how you work and how much you work for, and still claims that you're self-employed. They hand you a 1099 tax form, and you're supposed to fill it out as if you're in business for yourself. And of course, when you're seeking work, sometimes you accept that arrangement as a condition of employment. As I say, legitimate independent contractors are truly in business for themselves. They control every aspect of their operation. And by the way, legitimate independent contractors make more on average than employees in the same occupational groups. But for those who experience fraudulent arrangement called, fraudulent independent contracting, no. They make a lot less and suffer in other ways as well. We're going to go further into that. So why is it important about whether you are considered a legal employee or an independent contractor? I think you probably know this. Employers are covered by all our employment and labor laws. Independent contractors are not. And that includes so many things. Minimum wage and overtime pay. For employees, the employer will pay into Social Security for you. Otherwise, no. Employees are covered by anti-discrimination law, wrongful termination law, unemployment insurance, workers' comp. Employees have a right to form a union, at least on paper. And, your employer is responsible for providing you with a safe workplace, and on and on. Independent contractors are covered by none of this. It's called misclassification, and when you are fraudulently labeled as an independent contractor. There are come-ons, and you've probably seen them, if you're looking for jobs. Be your own boss, right? Make your own schedule, work only when you want to. A lot of the companies who are, Uber is our most prominent example these days of a firm that's been based on misclassification is Uber. FedEx has a long history. The FedEx ground, the drivers for the FedEx ground trucks, have notoriously been put into debt and exhausted by the kinds of arrangements that FedEx makes. But a lot of industries that employ college graduates do the same thing, especially in IT. Some of the cable installation jobs, or I met a young man doing insect control, who was an independent contractor. The good news is we're fighting, and many renegade employers are paying big fines. Of course, there are many more out there. Some states are passing good legislation, and groups of workers are winning justice on this issue. Port truckers was one big group out in California at the port of LA. Thousands of them, misclassified, who living in dire poverty because of the arrangement. Won a big case. Devious scheme number 2, temp agency work. Judith, you've never heard of this, I know. But so here are some more come-ons, from the temp industry. We hear about or see, get experience, get your foot in the door as a temp. You'll have flexible hours. None of this is really true. You can't make your own schedule. And when they say you'll be converted from a temp to a permanent worker, this happens, in some cases, only very rarely. There's no, even an indentured servant had a 7-year contract or some kind of contract, but the temporary worker who's promised a permanent job down the line doesn't even have a written contract that says anything like that. So permatemps are very common. Now, this is an arrangement where you have an intermediary between the parent employer and the worker. And therefore, the parent employer, that's really the company that's benefiting from your work. They don't know you. You receive no benefits or no recognition.
Can you tell us an example of a company that does this so that students can picture it? Like, what does it look like when there is a temp agency? Like, what kind of agency would that be?
Right. I have worked a lot with temp agency workers who work for Microsoft. Okay. Most recently, I worked with a group of people who were working for a temp agency called Lionbridge Technologies, and they were doing all the translating of the Microsoft software into, well, all sorts of languages. So many of these workers were here on visas, H-1B visas in particular. Not all of them, but many. And so they kind of they were contingent in not one but two ways. And here's how it works. It's been called a triangular employment relationship. Let's say the client firm is Microsoft. And Microsoft, by the way, uses thousands of temp agency workers, okay, at any one time. They want to hire people to test their software or do any other kind of work on their main products. Rather than advertise directly to people in the workforce, they go to a temp agency. And the temp agency either recruits workers or simply payrolls the workers that Microsoft already has, puts them on their own payroll, and becomes the, quote, employer of record. Even though the temp agency is not present in the workplace, even though they're not directing work or controlling conditions or terms, they are known or viewed by law as the sole employer of the temp workers. Microsoft is paying the temp agency $45 an hour for these workers. The workers are then paid maybe $25 an hour. I'm approximating. That's a big cut. I mean, the temp agency is making sometimes as much as the worker, him or herself, every hour. Can you imagine? What happens when temp workers have a complaint? Can they go to Microsoft and lodge that complaint and speak to a Microsoft supervisor about it or the human resources department? No. Microsoft says, we're not your employer. Go speak to the folks at Lionbridge. This is how it works. And Yenny, did that answer your question? I know you're looking for more examples, and they're all over because the temp industry is in just about everywhere. In fact, I've actually I've pretty much covered this. But the examples at the top, Microsoft, lab scientists who were hired through Kelly Services. You graduate with a bachelor's in one of the sciences, you've had some lab experience, you're having a hard time getting a job directly with one of the companies. And so they hire you through Kelly Services to do lab work. And you become an ordinary wage slave, And the rate of pay might sound good to us, It's $22 an hour. Okay, that sure beats $10 an hour, right? But the rate of exploitation is really through the roof because what you're producing for that company, that science company, is way, way more than what they're paying you. And of course, the temp agency is taking a hefty slice of your pay. The hospitality industry, the healthcare industry, accounting, law, these are all fields that are temped out. You'd be surprised how many young lawyers go to work for temp agencies, and the work is so boring. It's really drudgery. Oh, okay. Good. Yeah, there are many more temp agency offices. Okay, there are more temp agency offices in the U.S. than fast food outlets, combining McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's. What's the good news? We are passing some state laws to protect temp agency workers' rights, or expanding them anyway. And we recently, 2015, the Labor Board, during the Obama administration, gave us a really good ruling, which helps us define the parent companies, the user firms, as joint employers. In other words, making them responsible for some of the conditions in their own plants. We haven't been able to use it yet. It's so hard. But we have that law now. Devious scheme number 3. How am I doing on time, Yenny? Okay. Devious scheme number 3, franchised workers. So now, of course, the fast food industry gives us, a prime example. But many, many types of businesses are run as franchises now. And workers are all facing there are 9 million, that's an approximation, 9 million franchised workers in the United States. That's a lot. But the franchisor, the corporate, the parent organization, usually controls very tightly what you're doing on the job, the labor process. It also sets up an economic structure which makes it very difficult for the franchisee to do anything but pay you low wages. Why has the fast food industry been known for low wages? Is it because the managers of each one of those restaurants, they call them restaurants, but is it because the manager of each restaurant is stingy? Well, maybe, yeah. But that individual is being stingy because the McDonald's Corporation is squeezing every last drop of profit they can from each and every franchise operation. And very little is left over for those managers to share with their employees. And they end up having to do all kinds of things to make a living themselves, which means breaking basic labor laws, violating basic labor laws, and this on-call scheduling, the scheduling abuse that we'll get back to in a moment. That franchise arrangement shields the corporation. It shields McDonald's and other franchisors from they're not an employer. They've been fighting to maintain that status for so long. And they've got a new friend now, because in the Trump administration backs that idea. So if you're working for McDonald's, you have a McDonald's uniform on, right? You have McDonald's cap, I don't know. You say whatever McDonald's is telling you to say. Are you an employee of McDonald's? No. If you want to form a union among McDonald's employees in your own restaurant, or combine with McDonald's workers throughout the state or throughout the country, wow, what a great idea. The National Labor Relations Board says, no, sorry. McDonald's is not any of your employees. You all have 1,000 different employers. Try organizing that when each and every week your schedule is changed. Now, how does McDonald's, as a franchise, avoid worker pressure? Just don't give them any hours. So it effectively blocks workers from union organizing. The arrangement, the franchise arrangement. Yeah, I think I've covered this. Wage repression or wage suppression is built into that arrangement. We've heard a lot about global supply chains. That's what they call them in the business school. And by the way, I teach in the business school now, too. We call it global supply chains. I call it extended subcontracting chains. Often they're global in scope. But you can end up with several levels or layers of subcontracts. As we talked about before with independent contractors, there are legitimate subcontractors. And some subcontractors offer decent jobs. Yeah. But there are also what can be called faux subcontractors or artificial subcontractors who are more or less controlled, dependent on that one parent organization that's really setting the terms. And there, the worker is squeezed and without rights at the bottom. No way to move back up the chain to put pressure on that primary or that parent organization. There have been some ways to do that, but it's not easy. Device number one. These devices can be combined with the arrangements I talked about before. So, for instance, non-compete agreements have been used by franchise operations like Jimmy John's. You know what a non-compete agreement is? It's a provision or clause within your employment contract that says you cannot, if you leave employment, let's say at Jimmy John's, you cannot work for another similar kind of establishment. You cannot work in this business within a certain geographic range. So, you learn how to make sandwiches, but they're not paying you very much. You find out you can make $1 more at a different sandwich shop on the other end of town. That non-compete could prevent you from taking that job. Is it legal? Well, it's legal unless the state has passed a law against it. It's legal. That doesn't mean a court would enforce it. But what low-wage worker has the means to take it to court? Come on, you're out of a job. You're making minimum wage or close to it. Supposedly non-competes protect a company's trade secrets. But in the case what I'm talking about, they're really simply ways to hold on to employees, intimidate employees, and hold wages low. It prevents workers from moving to a better paying job. There's that article about Camp Bow Wow, which was a dog sitting operation, and they had these non-compete contracts. It's kind of a humorous situation to look up. Good news, yeah, Jimmy John's has backed down, and they've taken these non-competes out of their employment contracts. Good for them. We can eat at Jimmy John's again. And a number of states have passed laws to restrict the use of non-compete agreements for low-wage employees. And courts never intended them to be used for low-wage employees. So that's good. Nonetheless, the federal bill, has no chance. You'll notice that a lot of the good legislation that's being passed to protect workers is being passed at the state level or even the municipal level, because our federal government, well, on the one hand, it's entirely gridlocked, and on the other hand, it has been for so long anti-worker. I think probably many of you know about scheduling abuse. Anyone? Because it's hard to have gotten a job as a young person in recent times. That's not you, Yana. No. Anyone here experienced with schedule abuse? It's being on call. It's being on call at any time to go to work. And it kind of disrupts your personal life or your family life, of course. It prevents you from taking other jobs. It's really horrible. And again, it's really about lowering labor costs. The business doesn't, let's say it's a retail business at a mall. They don't want to pay 1 hour's wage where they could have saved it by having someone home, right? And they have computer programs to do this, down to a science or an algorithm or whatever we call it these days. Good news again, states and municipalities are passing predictability in scheduling and fair work week laws. Not many, but some. This is New York's Fair Work Week. I don't think all of this is inscribed in statutes yet. But this is the kind of Fair Work Week legislation that's being pushed around the country. Retailers prohibited from using on-call scheduling. Must post schedules 72 hours in advance. Fast food employers must provide 14 days of notice, et cetera, et cetera. They need to pay additional compensation when they do call you at the last minute. In Europe, we used to call it unsociable hours. You're working unsociable hours or on a minute's notice, you need to pay more to get that kind of on-demand service, right? Device number 3. This is really wicked. I don't know. Tell me your opinion. You know what forced mandatory arbitration agreements are? It's an agreement, again, it's embedded in an employment contract. And it says that you as an employee must bring any dispute you have with our company into our internal arbitration process. Okay? You cannot go to court against our company. You're giving up your right to go to court to get this job. So I don't care what your complaint is. Your wages have been stolen. You feel you're a victim of discrimination on the job, gender discrimination, race discrimination, whatever. Whatever your complaint, you're not allowed to go to a lawyer and bring that case to court against the company. And this is one that the courts have upheld. The Supreme Court of the United States has backed this idea, has supported this idea. It's not final yet. So, yes, employees are prevented. access to the courts is now barred for more than 60 million American workers who have signed those mandatory arbitration agreements. They've also begun taking away our right to class action lawsuits. Right. This is the way employees have often, the only way we've sometimes been able to fight back, the huge class action suit that women fought against Walmart. It's still going on. Been in the process for over 10 years against gender discrimination, against Walmart's practices of gender discrimination. But if those workers had signed away their right to go to court, this would not have been possible. Any questions about that? Yeah. Oh.
Just that I've noticed that the arbitration clause seems to appear in a lot of software terms and services. So it's not just in the workplace, but just any products or services you consume. If they make you sign the terms of a service agreement, it usually includes an arbitration clause in it so that they can't be sued for anything, any damages that might be caused by the product use or, yeah.
And what's your name?
Rafael.
Raphael?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's constitutional? Like, do you think that
It shouldn't be. I don't know. I'm not sure, but it shouldn't be.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, the court system is there for citizens to take advantage of. How can you prevent citizens from utilizing our courts? They talk about having your day in court, right? Whether you have a case or not, let the jury, let the judge decide. That right is taken away from us here. And I think we need to be vigilant about fighting this. Jenny. Oh. All right, we're going to wrap it up, but I want to save some time to hear from some more of you. Let's see, just to go quickly. The last part of my presentation was about how regulations are being changed through executive order, reducing overtime pay, taking away unemployment compensation from many people, possibility of getting unemployment compensation. Oh, tipped employees. How many of you have been tipped employees? We'll hear about that in a moment. I want to hear about that. Yeah, and here it is. What are your work experiences? Tell me about being a tipped employee. Hold on one sec.
I'm actually a hostess at a restaurant, so like my tip is optional, but I work at a restaurant. I know that the struggle that they go through, and it's really, really hard for them. I work at actually like a really expensive restaurant, but even getting tipped, like, it's so difficult. They try so hard for the tips, and it's like it's not enough. Even with tips, like sometimes they get like 4 tables, and like they tip them like $40 each table. That's not enough at all. They work from like 3 all the way to like 4 a.m. sometimes, and it's not enough.
Thank you. Who else? Did you have a comment on this? Please.
Yeah, I used to work for a Canadian restaurant, and when I first started, I was also a hostess, and we would actually get paid minimum wage plus the tips. So it was like a lot of the time.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times, a lot of girls were, and it was like the tip was based on the percentage of what the restaurant had made that day. So it was just kind of inconsistent, and eventually they changed it.
So the tips were pooled by the employer and then distributed evenly among the tipped employees. And the tips were over and above your minimum wage, correct? Yes, this is Canada. It's a decent law. We only have 8 states that have that kind of equal treatment law. In 8 states, they've abolished this sub-minimum tipped employee wage, which is so low for tipped workers. And so in those 8 states, tipped workers still receive the full minimum wage. In Florida, would be $8.25 right now, and tips on top of that. There's this really ugly thing that went on recently. The Trump administration has proposed a rule that would make it easier for employees to pool the tips and even keep the tips. As long as each employee made minimum wage, the employee could pocket the rest of the tips under this outrageous. I mean, if you're sitting at a table and you're leaving a tip, it's because that server, you're leaving that tip for the server. And sometimes it's going to be divided with kitchen staff or something. Nonetheless, it's for the low-wage workers in that restaurant. But this is really wicked stuff. Very wicked. Why am I talking? This is supposed to be about you right now. So what other work experience you have, or any questions?
I have one. Here, on this side.
Jenny.
I have one question about academia. And there's debate about adjunct faculty, there's debate about teaching assistants, and whether the employment protections are in place for them. What's the state of affairs for people working in higher ed right now?
Now, which group of workers are you referring to?
Well, first adjunct faculty, and then also teaching assistants, and yeah.
Oh, that's a small subject, adjunct faculty. The situation with adjunct faculty across the country is so astonishing. In Florida, SEIU has been campaigning around the state. They've won some union elections, right? Including at Miami-Dade College, right, just recently, and other places around the state. But then you get into negotiations with these institutions. And we're talking now about state-funded institutions, not the private ones, right? And even there, they run into some really tough negotiating, to even get, a little bit better in a contract. And by the way, I don't know if there are any tenured professors in here, but the tenured professors often don't support the adjuncts at all. They're told that having a lot of adjuncts around helps them keep their high salaries, right? Because if the university can save money on paying adjuncts at the lower levels, then what's saved can go to fatten the salaries of, faculty at the top. See, that's very short-sighted. In the long run, that really brings the entire university down, Talk to your tenured professors about it. So, Jenny, it's such a big subject. If you want to talk some more later, we can talk about it. Are you an adjunct professor?
No. But I am interested in academia, and I work in the administrative side of it. And so I've heard a lot of conversations about it, and I don't think often enough we know about what we could do to make things differently. Are there only it's unions are only way of pushing different legislation, or can we join nonprofit organizations that are advancing this work? So that is not talked about at all.
Right.
So that's why I was trying to
union
get
is
your
not
comments.
not the only way to address the issue. Right. One thing that should be done is the parents of college students should be really told what those professors are making in their classrooms. Students don't even know, actually, because adjunct professors don't come in and say, I'm getting $2,000 for this course, and I have to teach 7 other courses this semester in order just to get by. It's equivalent to say what a close anyway to what a domestic worker makes or even a farm worker. Well, maybe not that bad sometimes, but similar situation. You're doing piecework, right? And you know how farm workers get paid by the bushel of apples or oranges or tomatoes, by the bucket of tomatoes that they've picked. And so that's the way adjuncts work by the class. If there's not enough students in the class, you don't get as much money. You've done the same work, well, maybe a little less grading, but it's really medieval. A wicked system. I think you all know the statistic on this. Almost half of all courses now throughout higher education are taught by these adjuncts. Or graduate students, graduate employees, and so on. So, Yenny, is my time up?
No, you have 5 more minutes.
Really? Wow, fantastic. Does anyone else have question, comment, experience to share? Yeah, hold on one sec, Judith. Get the microphone up to you.
Thank you. Because typically when you think about on-demand scheduling, you think about, the services like retail and restaurants. But I think with the advent of technology and have access to computers and email, it's a different type of on-demand scheduling and or work. So I'm not sure if you talked about legislature looking at on-demand scheduling and what employers need to do to make sure that the schedule is posted 14 days ahead of time or 72 hours ahead of time. But it's a larger issue as well when you think about the use of technology for work in terms of email and have access to different computer systems, working on your off time.
Right. When they use this term gig economy, that's often what they're referring to, right? It's usually a young person using a mobile app, right? Excuse me?
Or not so young person.
Not so young, yeah. And using a mobile app to find out about a casual job that they can take on in the next few hours when they happen to have time, right? Amazon Flex is like that. Amazon Flex, right after this session ends, you can go deliver a few packages, And, of course, you're going to use your own vehicle and pay your own gas because they want to make sure of that because that's one of the ways they can say, well, you're an independent contractor, you're using your own car. And if you want insurance, you have to buy it yourself. But that's the kind of... Now, what kind of work were you thinking of?
But just in management in general. 7. So you kind of always on.
Oh. Oh, you got a whole different problem, sister. Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Yes, you are. Yeah. This is called work spill. When your work spills over into every other moment of your life, possibly. You're sitting on the beach, as long as you've got your phone there, you may be contacted by your boss or by people you're serving, your clients, your students, whatever. Yeah, that's another way to look at on-demand. But not the kind of on-demand that the laws are addressing. The statutes are addressing that kind of on-call work that we're familiar with from the retail industry or the fast food industry, right? Oh, yes.
Yeah. Before I used to have a actual full-paying job. The pay was decent, the benefits were decent. The only thing was that the management and the environment we're working in was terrible. And there was a lot of, despite that we're full-paid employees and we're supposed to have all the benefits and everything, there was still a lot of turnover. Turnover. So there were a lot of people being hired and fired. There was almost like a year where we were always constantly below the minimum required amount of labor needed to actually fulfill the job, correctly and, to safe standards.
What kind of work was
I
this?
was a surveillance at Mikazuki, a resort and casino. And the environment was not very good. It was, I would say, deteriorating, like very stressful, very hard to maintain our areas clean and maintain our health. And there were constant schedule changes. And
Are you doing security work?
no, surveillance. That meant I was looking at cameras all day, mostly. But also,
Were you hired directly by Mikasuki or by an agency?
no, I was hired directly, thankfully.
Okay, and it was a full-time job.
It was a full-time job. I got full benefits. I was
Yeah.
paid well. The job was terrible. Definitely in other departments, you could see that there were more temporary part-time work, and they had even more turnover. The wages varied hugely.
It's not easy keeping your eyes on those screens. all
No, it
day.
isn't. And like I said, there was huge turnover where you would get fired for the smallest infractions.
Really.
Um,
So was there any progressive discipline system, or could they fire you like with one infraction, one slip up and you're gone? Or
Yeah.
was there any contract that talked about a due process or a just cause? Do you know what I mean? Did your contract say anything about giving you, say, three strikes and you're out, or is it
no,
simply up to the employer to get rid of you whenever they want?
seemed like it was up to the employer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's called at-will employment. So I mean, the majority of Americans are at-will employees, and employers can fire you at any time for any reason or for no reason at all,
Yeah, there was definitely
at a whim,
yeah,
on a whim.
there was definitely a coworker.
But
who I
you left on
remember.
your own.
No, I left on my own eventually. Yeah, because again, the environment was getting to the point where it was unhealthy, and like I said, there was always less than the required amount of labor needed to complete the job, and they were still paying us the same amount, no matter
Right,
what.
right. Well, thank you for telling us about it. Any other comments, questions, experiences? Yes. There you go. Our Canadian. See, Canada has better labor laws. A little better.
Based off what he was kind of saying about like being in an environment where it was unhealthy, where they didn't really care about the employees, do you think that in a way is kind of combating some of these like bogus schemes that jobs are doing, where like more and more, especially within at least my generation, where we're finding ourselves seeking jobs that have better benefits, better work environments? Do you think that kind of helps combat some of these issues?
I'm sorry, I was listening, but I missed
Sorry.
that question. Say it
I
again,
guess my
please.
question is that I just noticed that a lot of people within my generation, that we find ourselves kind of job hopping a lot more than our parents
Right,
did, because we're more likely to go somewhere where they value our labor. Do you think that this is like a way that we're kind of combating some of these schemes, where we're kind of like, we're not putting up with it anymore?
It could be that, like, what was your name again? Raphael. Yeah, like Raphael, it could be that you're leaving a bad situation for a better one. Or it could be, of course, that all this job hopping simply reflects the fact that none of the jobs are good, right? And they're all casual, and there's nothing attractive about any of them. So it depends.
What parents may have had that you are now having with your employer. So, you're not necessarily feel committed or compelled to stay with a particular employer because it's not necessarily a mutual agreement as it was in the past. So people would actually stay in a job for 30 and 40 years because they had a mutual understanding. They were both benefiting, the employer and the employer. Now it can be a bit one-sided and not mutual. So you'll find that your generation, not necessarily committed to an employer like your parents may have been.
Yeah, and one more thing about it, we can pass laws to help people who are working temporary jobs, a series of temporary jobs. For instance, having a portable benefits system that you can take from one job to the next, right? And you can build, say, some retirement savings, or you can take your health care with you wherever you go, which is not your problem in Canada. But we could have some better, laws to protect employees even when they're having to move around so much.
Yeah. Just on the turnover, I remember reading, it wasn't even an official thing or official article, it was just a Twitter thread, but it was basically asking how many jobs people under 35 have had.
Yeah.
And majority are over 10 jobs,
Right.
10 different kinds of jobs, including commission jobs, including,
Yeah, that's one thing that's so different, from what the old timers after World War II, were doing, where they took a job and in many cases they could keep it for life, right? Retire after 25 years or 30 years with a pension. That's unheard of now.
You know if there are any studies that have more concrete numbers as to how many jobs are
That's a hard
somebody
statistic to collect. But yeah, there are studies on that. You could find them. All right. Yenny is saying that's it. We're good. So, you get out while things are good, right?
Any
Thanks.
more final comments before we wrap it up?
Thanks very much for coming. Thank you
Thank you
for
so
all
much.
your comments. Fabulous.